The Korean peninsula trembled under the weight of war in the sweltering heat of September 1950. General Douglas MacArthur stood on the deck of the USS Mount McKinley, his weathered hands gripping the ship's railing as he gazed toward the treacherous waters of Inchon harbor. The 60-year-old commander's piercing eyes reflected both determination and the crushing burden of a nation's survival resting on his shoulders. Behind him, the largest amphibious assault force assembled, since the Second World War prepared for what many considered military suicide. The stakes could not have been higher. North Korean forces had pushed United Nations troops into a desperate perimeter around the southern port city of Busan, threatening to drive them into the sea. South Korea teetered on the brink of complete collapse, with communist forces controlling nearly 90% of the peninsula. "Sir, the Joint Chiefs are still expressing serious reservations about the operation," Colonel Edward Almond reported, approaching MacArthur with a folder of intelligence reports. The tides at Inchon presented a nightmare scenario for amphibious warfare, rising and falling over 30 feet, creating treacherous mudflats that could strand landing craft for hours. The narrow channel approach was heavily fortified, and the city's sea walls rose 15 feet above high tide. MacArthur turned from the railing, his trademark corncob pipe clenched between his teeth. "That's precisely why they'll never expect us there, Colonel. The impossible becomes possible when your enemy believes it cannot be done." His voice carried the confidence that had made him a legend in the Pacific theater, though privately, he knew this gamble would either secure his place in military history or end his storied career in disgrace. The genesis of Operation Chromite, as the Inchon landing was codenamed, lay in MacArthur's audacious strategic vision. While conventional military wisdom demanded reinforcing the Busan perimeter directly, MacArthur recognized that such an approach would only prolong the stalemate. Instead, he proposed striking deep behind enemy lines at Inchon, Seoul's port city, cutting North Korean supply lines and forcing them to fight on two fronts simultaneously. Admiral James Doyle, commander of the amphibious forces, had initially opposed the plan with characteristic naval pragmatism. "General, we've identified 31 separate factors that make Inchon unsuitable for amphibious assault," he had argued during planning sessions. The harbor's extreme tidal variations meant landing craft would have only brief windows to reach shore before becoming stranded on mudflats. The narrow flying fish channel was easily defended, and intelligence suggested the North Koreans had fortified the approaches with mines and artillery. Yet MacArthur's strategic genius lay in transforming these apparent disadvantages into tactical opportunities. The very factors that made Inchon seem impossible to assault would ensure complete tactical surprise. North Korean forces, confident in the harbor's natural defenses, had deployed only minimal garrison troops to defend the city. Their main strength remained concentrated around the Busan perimeter, where they expected the decisive battle to unfold. As September 15th dawned gray and misty over the Yellow Sea, the assembled fleet represented the largest amphibious operation since the Allied landings at Normandy. 261 ships carrying 70,000 troops from the United States, South Korea, and United Kingdom prepared to execute one of military history's most daring maneuvers. The 1st Marine Division, veterans of Pacific campaigns, would spearhead the assault on Red Beach and Green Beach, while the Army's 7th Infantry Division would follow to consolidate the beachhead. The morning's pre-assault bombardment began at dawn, with naval gunfire and airstrikes pounding suspected enemy positions. MacArthur watched the distant explosions through binoculars, knowing that within hours, the fate of South Korea, and perhaps the entire Cold War balance in Asia, would be decided on Inchon's contested shores. The first wave of landing craft churned through the choppy waters of Flying Fish Channel as the morning tide reached its peak on September 15th. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray, commanding the 5th Marine Regiment, crouched in the lead boat as machine gun fire began chattering from Wolmi Island, the fortified position guarding Inchon's inner harbor. The North Korean defenders had finally awakened to the reality of the assault, but precious hours of preparation had been lost to disbelief and confusion. Wolmi Island stood like a concrete sentinel in the harbor's mouth, its gun emplacements commanding every approach to the main landing. Beaches. Marine corsairs screamed overhead, diving to suppress enemy fire with rockets and napalm, while naval destroyers closed to point-blank range to blast the island's fortifications. The thunder of battle echoed across the water as the first Marines scrambled up the rocky shores under intense fire. According to military historian David Halberstam's account in The Coldest Winter, the assault on Wolmi Island became a microcosm of the entire operation's audacity. Captain Robert Barrow led his company through a maze of bunkers and trenches, fighting house to house against determined North Korean defenders who had been caught completely off guard by the amphibious assault. By 10:30 in the morning, the Stars and Stripes flew over the island's highest point, securing the harbor entrance for the main landings. The real test came with the afternoon tide at Red Beach, where the 5th Marines faced their greatest challenge. The seawall loomed 15 feet above the high water mark, requiring specially equipped scaling ladders that had to be manhandled into position under enemy fire. Colonel Murray's men found themselves pinned down on a narrow strip of beach as North Korean reinforcements rushed toward the sound of battle from Seoul, Private First Class. Herbert Thomas clutched his rifle as enemy bullets whined overhead. The teenage Marine from Ohio, suddenly understanding why his officers had called this operation desperate. The scaling ladders proved unwieldy under combat conditions, and several squads found themselves trapped between the seawall and the incoming tide. For critical minutes, the entire landing force remained vulnerable to counterattack, compressed into a killing zone with nowhere to retreat. Lieutenant Baldomero Lopez emerged as an unlikely hero in these desperate moments. The young officer from Tampa had volunteered to lead the assault on the seawall despite being wounded in the shoulder during the approach. Grabbing a satchel charge, Lopez scrambled up a damaged ladder and hurled himself at a North Korean bunker that was decimating his platoon. The explosion silenced the position, but claimed Lopez's life, earning him a posthumous Medal of Honor and clearing the way for his men to establish their foothold. Meanwhile, at Green Beach on the city's southern flank, the 1st Marine Regiment faced a different challenge. The landing site consisted of mud flats that extended hundreds of yards from the seawall, forcing the assault troops to wade through knee-deep mud while under fire. Lieutenant Colonel Alan Sutter's battalion moved like ghosts through the industrial district, clearing warehouses and factory buildings in brutal close-quarters combat. The North Korean defense of Inchon revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their military doctrine. Individual soldiers fought with desperate courage, but the lack of coordinated command structure left them vulnerable to the Marines' superior training and equipment. Colonel Kim Jong-mu, the North Korean garrison commander, had only 2,000 troops to defend a city of 200,000, and most of his heavy weapons remained positioned to defend against a conventional overland attack. As darkness fell over Inchon, MacArthur's gamble appeared to be paying dividends. The Marines had secured both landing beaches and were pushing inland against crumbling resistance. Communication intercepts revealed growing panic among North Korean commanders, who suddenly realized their main supply line through Seoul was under direct threat. Yet the most challenging phase of Operation Chromite lay ahead. Securing Inchon was only the first step in MacArthur's master plan. The real prize was Seoul, the political and logistical heart of North Korea's southern offensive. 25 miles of contested territory stretched between the Marines and the capital, defended by increasingly desperate enemy forces who understood that losing Seoul meant losing the war. General Edward Almond, commanding the 10th Corps, established his headquarters in a captured North Korean building overlooking Inchon Harbor. As he surveyed intelligence reports throughout the night, one fact became clear. The enemy was already beginning to withdraw from the Pusan perimeter to defend Seoul. MacArthur's strategic masterstroke was forcing the North Koreans to fight the Yas Two-front war they could not win. The rumble of tank engines echoed through Inchon's narrow streets as the 1st Marine Division prepared for the most crucial phase of Operation Chromite. Dawn on September 16th revealed a city in chaos, with North Korean defenders retreating in disorder, while civilian refugees streamed through the rubble-strewn avenues. General Oliver Smith, the Marine Division commander, understood that speed would determine success. Every hour of delay allowed the enemy to strengthen Seoul's defenses. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis led the 1st Battalion 5th Marines in the vanguard of the advance toward Kimpo Airfield, the strategic prize that would allow United Nations air power to support the assault on Seoul. The Marines moved in tactical columns through rice paddies and villages, encountering sporadic resistance from North Korean rearguard units that had been ordered to slow the advance at any cost. The terrain between Inchon and Seoul presented unique challenges for mechanized warfare. Ancient rice terraces created natural tank obstacles, while narrow causeways between flooded fields channeled the advance into potential killing zones. Captain John Stevens, commanding a company of Sherman tanks, found his armored vehicles struggling through mud that sucked at their tracks like quicksand. "We're not fighting the North Koreans as much as we're fighting Korea itself," Stevens observed to his radio operator as his tank lurched through another waterlogged field. The monsoon season had turned the peninsula's dirt roads into impassable quagmires, forcing the Marines to advance cross-country through terrain that favored the defending infantry. Despite these obstacles, the momentum of surprise continued to work in favor of the attackers. North Korean units, isolated from higher command by the rapid American advance, frequently surrendered without resistance when confronted by determined Marines. Major Frank Shepard's battalion captured over 300 prisoners in a single engagement near Sosa, many of them teenage conscripts who had been pressed into service only weeks earlier. The capture of Kimpo Airfield on September 17th marked a turning point in the campaign. Marine engineers worked frantically to repair the runway while Corsair fighters circled overhead, protecting the vital installation from counterattack. Within hours, the first transport planes were landing with ammunition and medical supplies, establishing an air bridge that would sustain the advance on Seoul. Colonel Homer Litzenberg, commanding the 7th Marines, received orders to seize the high ground overlooking Seoul's western approaches. His regiment faced the strongest opposition yet encountered, as North Korean forces had established defensive positions along the ridgelines that commanded the approaches to the capital. The battle for Hill 294 became a brutal test of Marine training and determination. Private Robert Wilson, a machine gunner from Detroit, found himself pinned down by enemy mortar fire as his squad attempted to assault the hill's forward slopes. The 19-year-old had enlisted immediately after high school, drawn by Marine Corps recruiting posters that promised adventure and honor. Now, crouched behind a fallen tree with bullets snapping overhead, Wilson discovered that combat bore little resemblance to Hollywood depictions of warfare. The assault on Hill 294 demonstrated the evolution of North Korean tactics as the campaign progressed. Instead of the confused, piecemeal resistance encountered at Inchon, the defenders employed coordinated artillery and mortar fire to break up Marine attacks. Chinese-supplied anti-tank weapons began appearing in significant numbers, forcing American armor to operate with greater caution. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Taplett's 3rd Battalion bore the brunt of the hill fighting, losing 63 casualties in 2 days of continuous combat. Yet the Marines' superior training and firepower gradually wore down the defenders. Close air support from Navy and Marine Corps aircraft proved decisive, with Corsairs delivering precision strikes against enemy positions that could not be reached by artillery. By September 20th, Seoul's outer defenses were crumbling under sustained pressure from 3 Marine regiments converging on the capital. Colonel Kim Chak, commanding the North Korean Seoul Defense Command, faced an impossible situation. His forces were being compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter while supplies and reinforcements remained cut off by American air power. Fai. Psychological impact of the Inchon landing was becoming evident throughout the Korean peninsula. North Korean units around the Pusan perimeter began withdrawing northward to defend their threatened supply lines, relieving pressure on United Nations forces that had been barely holding their positions. General Walton Walker's 8th Army prepared to break out of the Pusan perimeter, creating the two-front war that MacArthur had envisioned. As Marine patrols probed Seoul's outskirts, the city's 2 million inhabitants faced an uncertain future. Many had initially welcomed North Korean occupation as liberation from years of political instability, but months of communist rule had bred widespread disillusionment. Secret intelligence reports suggested that significant portions of the population were prepared to support United Nations forces if they could guarantee protection from communist reprisals. The stage was set for the climactic battle of the Inchon campaign. Seoul, the ancient capital of Korea and symbol of national identity for both North and South, would become the prize for which both sides were prepared to pay any price in blood. The ancient walls of Seoul trembled under the weight of artillery, bombardment, as September 21st dawned gray and smoky over the Korean capital. General Douglas MacArthur stood in the ruins of Kimpo Airfield's control tower, studying detailed maps of the city's street layout while Marine corsairs thundered overhead on close support missions. The 70-year-old commander knew that capturing Seoul would require more than military victory. It demanded a political statement that would resonate throughout Asia. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, the legendary Marine officer commanding the 1st Battalion 1st Marines, led his men through Seoul's western suburbs against increasingly desperate resistance. The North Korean defenders had transformed the city into a fortress, with barricades, blocking major intersections and snipers positioned in every building. House-to-house fighting became the norm as Marines cleared each structure with grenades and bayonets. The battle for Seoul Central Railroad Station epitomized the savage urban warfare that characterized the campaign's final phase. Captain Robert Barrow's company found themselves trapped in a maze of railway cars and switching yards while enemy machine guns commanded every avenue of approach. For 6 hours, the Marines fought their way through the industrial complex, using Bangalore torpedoes to blast through steel barriers and flamethrowers to clear bunkers. Sergeant James Mitchell, a veteran of the Pacific campaigns, led his squad in a flanking attack that finally broke the deadlock at the railroad station. The 30-year-old career Marine from Alabama had survived Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, but he found Seoul's urban environment uniquely challenging. Every window could hide a sniper, every doorway might be booby-trapped, Mitchell explained to his replacement troops between engagements. The civilian population of Seoul found themselves caught between competing armies as the battle intensified. Thousands of refugees crowded into schools and temples, seeking shelter from the artillery bombardment that turned entire neighborhoods into rubble. Marine corpsmen worked alongside South Korean medical personnel to establish aid stations, treating both military casualties and civilian victims of the urban warfare. North Korean Colonel Park Chung-hee, defending the government district, recognized that his situation had become hopeless, but continued resistance on direct orders from Pyongyang. Communist doctrine demanded that Seoul be held at any cost, viewing the capital's loss as tantamount to admitting defeat in the entire Korean campaign. Park's remaining 2,000 defenders prepared for a final stand among the government buildings that had become symbols of North Korean authority. The assault on the Capitol building required careful coordination between Marine infantry, armor, and air support. Lieutenant Colonel Alan Sutter's battalion approached through the University District while Sherman tanks provided covering fire against enemy positions in the building's upper floors. Marine architects studied pre-war construction plans to identify structural weaknesses that could be exploited by demolition teams. Private First Class Eugene McCarthy, a radio man from Boston, crouched in the shadow of an overturned streetcar as his unit called in close air support against a particularly stubborn enemy strongpoint. The 20-year-old had volunteered for Korea despite his mother's tears. convinced that stopping communism in Asia was essential for America's security. Now, listening to wounded Marines calling for corpsmen, McCarthy began to understand the true cost of ideological warfare. Marine aviation played a crucial role in the final assault on Seoul's government quarter. Major Robert Gaylor, commanding a squadron of Corsair fighter bombers, coordinated with ground controllers to deliver precision strikes against enemy positions, while avoiding damage to historic structures. The challenge of urban close air support required split-second timing and absolute accuracy to prevent friendly fire incidents. According to military historian Clay Blair's comprehensive account, The Forgotten War, the Battle for Seoul represented a turning point in American military doctrine, demonstrating the complexity of urban warfare in the atomic age. The Marines discovered that traditional tactics required modification when fighting in densely populated areas where distinguishing combatants from civilians became increasingly difficult. The North Korean defense of Seoul revealed both the strength and limitations of communist military doctrine. Individual units fought with remarkable tenacity, often continuing resistance even after being cut off from command and supply. However, the lack of flexible leadership at lower levels prevented effective adaptation to rapidly changing tactical situations, allowing Marine initiative and training to gradually overcome superior numbers. By September 24th, organized, North Korean resistance in Seoul had collapsed, though scattered sniper fire continued for several more days. The South Korean flag was raised over the Capitol building in a ceremony attended by President Syngman Rhee, who had flown from Busan to reclaim his government's seat. MacArthur declared Seoul liberated, though the true test of liberation would come in the weeks ahead as United Nations forces attempted to establish stable governance in the war-torn city. The recapture of Seoul marked the strategic success of Operation Chromite, but MacArthur's ambitions extended far beyond merely restoring the status quo. Intelligence reports suggested that North Korean forces were in full retreat toward the 38th parallel, presenting an opportunity to reunify Korea under United Nations authority. The general began planning the next phase of his campaign, unaware that Chinese observers were already preparing their own response to American success. The abandoned trenches around the Busan perimeter stood silent on September 25th, their North Korean occupants having melted away in the night like shadows before dawn. General Walton Walker, commanding the 8th Army, surveyed the enemy positions that had threatened to push his forces into the sea just 2 weeks earlier. The 59-year-old Texan allowed himself a rare smile as he contemplated the speed with which MacArthur's Inchon gambit had transformed the entire strategic situation on the Korean peninsula. Intelligence reports flooding into Walker's headquarters painted a picture of North Korean forces in complete disarray. Entire divisions that had been besieging United Nations positions were now streaming northward in desperate attempts to avoid encirclement. Radio intercepts revealed panic among communist commanders who found their supply lines severed and their rear areas under attack by South Korean guerrillas emboldened by news of Seoul's recapture. Colonel John Michaelis, commanding the 27th Infantry Regiment, led the breakout from Busan with characteristic aggressiveness. His wolfhounds had earned their reputation during months of desperate defensive fighting, and now they savored the opportunity to pursue their tormentors across the Korean countryside. The regiment's advance guard reached Osan by September 26th, linking up with Marine patrols advancing south from Seoul. The meeting between 8th Army and 10th Corps forces at Osan symbolized the complete success of MacArthur's strategic vision. Lieutenant Robert Young of the 7th Cavalry Regiment shook hands with Staff Sergeant Paul Williams of the 5th Marines in a rice paddy south of the town, their brief encounter representing the closing of a trap that had ensnared the entire North Korean People's Army south of the 38th parallel. Prisoner interrogations revealed the extent of communist demoralization following the Inchon landing. Major Kim Song-il, a North Korean battalion commander captured near Suwon, explained through interpreters how news of the amphibious assault had spread panic through the ranks. The soldiers believed Americans could attack anywhere, anytime, Kim admitted. Our commanders lost control when supply trucks stopped arriving from Seoul. The rapid collapse of North Korean resistance created unexpected challenges for United Nations forces. Thousands of enemy soldiers surrendered daily, overwhelming prison facilities and straining logistics networks already stretched by the rapid advance. Colonel William Quinn, responsible for prisoner processing, established temporary camps throughout South Korea to handle the influx of captives seeking refuge from communist political officers who had threatened execution for desertion. MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo buzzed with planning for the next phase of operations, as reports confirmed the destruction of organized North Korean resistance south of Seoul. The general's staff prepared contingency plans for advancing beyond the 38th parallel. Despite explicit instructions from Washington to halt at the pre-war boundary between North and South Korea, the political implications of Operation Chromite's success extended far beyond the Korean peninsula. President Harry Truman faced mounting pressure from Congress and the American public to capitalize on military victory by reunifying Korea under United Nations authority. Senator Robert Taft argued that halting at the 38th parallel would constitute appeasement of communist aggression, while Secretary of State Dean Acheson warned of potential Chinese intervention if American forces approached the Yalu River. Behind the scenes, Chinese leaders in Beijing watched American success with growing alarm. Mao Zedong convened emergency sessions of the Communist Party leadership to discuss responses to what appeared to be a fundamental shift in the Asian balance of power. Intelligence sources in Hong Kong reported unusual military activity in Manchuria, where Chinese volunteers were reportedly massing near the Korean border. The humanitarian crisis in Seoul complicated efforts to consolidate political gains from military victory. Months of communist occupation had left the city's infrastructure in ruins, with power plants destroyed and water systems contaminated. Marine engineers worked alongside South Korean civilian authorities to restore basic services, while Army medical units established hospitals to treat thousands of civilians suffering from malnutrition and disease. Colonel Edward Forney, commanding the Marine Shore Party that had orchestrated the Inchon landing, now found himself responsible for managing Seoul's port facilities. The transition from combat operations to civil affairs required different skills, as military personnel struggled to understand the complex political dynamics of a city where collaboration with communist authorities had been necessary for survival. South. Korean President Syngman Rhee's return to Seoul on September 29th marked the formal restoration of his government's authority, though significant challenges remained. The 75-year-old leader had spent months in exile, while North Korean forces controlled most of his country, and his political base required rebuilding from the ground up. Rhee's authoritarian tendencies and anti-communist obsessions would create ongoing tensions with American advisors seeking to establish democratic institutions. The success of Operation Chromite established MacArthur as the preeminent American military hero of the early Cold War period. Newspaper editorials compared his strategic brilliance to Napoleon's greatest campaigns, while politicians from both parties praised his vindication of American military doctrine. Yet the general's growing confidence in his own infallibility would soon lead to decisions that transformed victory into strategic disaster, as Chinese forces prepared their own surprise intervention in the Korean conflict. The stage was set for the final act of the Inchon campaign's aftermath, as MacArthur's forces prepared to cross the 38th parallel in pursuit of total victory, unaware that their triumph had already triggered the chain of events that would bring China into the war and transform a regional conflict into a global confrontation between superpowers. The morning sun cast long shadows across the devastated landscape south of the 38th parallel as October dawned cold and clear over Korea. General Douglas, MacArthur stood before a gathering of war correspondents in Seoul's partially restored Capitol building, his uniform immaculate despite the rubble that surrounded him on all sides. The 70-year-old commander's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he prepared to announce what he believed would be the final chapter of the Korean conflict. "The North Korean army as a fighting force has ceased to exist," MacArthur declared to the assembled journalists, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a legend throughout the Pacific. Intelligence estimates suggested that fewer than 30,000 North Korean soldiers remained under arms north of the parallel, scattered and demoralized after losing nearly two-thirds of their original strength during the retreat from Seoul. Lieutenant General Edward Almond, commanding the 10th Corps, received orders to prepare for the advance into North Korea despite explicit reservations from the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. The 57-year-old Virginian had orchestrated the logistical miracle that sustained the Inchon landing, but he privately questioned the wisdom of pursuing a defeated enemy into unfamiliar territory where Chinese intervention remained a distinct possibility. The human cost of Operation Chromite was becoming clear as casualty reports filtered through military channels. American forces had suffered 3,000 casualties during the three-week campaign, while South Korean losses approached 10,000 dead and wounded. North Korean casualties remained impossible to calculate accurately, but prisoner interrogations suggested that entire divisions had simply disintegrated during the retreat from Seoul. Captain James Houseman, an American advisor to South Korean forces, witnessed firsthand the brutality that accompanied the communist retreat. North Korean political officers had executed thousands of suspected collaborators and South Korean prisoners rather than allow them to fall into United Nations hands. Mass graves discovered near Daejeon contained the bodies of American soldiers, captured during earlier fighting, their hands bound and skulls shattered by rifle bullets. The liberation of Seoul revealed the extent of communist oppression during 4 months of occupation. Father Patrick Burns, an Irish missionary who had remained in the city throughout the siege, described systematic attempts to destroy South Korean culture and identity. They rounded up teachers, police officers, government workers, anyone who represented the old order, Burns testified to American intelligence officers. The executions continued until the very day your Marines entered the city. Medical personnel accompanying the advancing forces documented widespread malnutrition and disease among the civilian population. Major Mary Walker, chief nurse of the Army Field Hospital in Seoul, reported treating hundreds of children suffering from typhoid fever and dysentery caused by contaminated water supplies. The communists destroyed the water treatment facilities. Before retreating, Walker explained in her official report, they seemed determined to leave nothing useful for the civilian population. The political implications of MacArthur's victory resonated throughout the Cold War world as October progressed. European allies pressed Washington to capitalize on success by negotiating a comprehensive peace settlement that would reunify Korea under United Nations supervision. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin warned that prolonging the conflict risked triggering Chinese intervention and potentially escalating into global war. Behind the scenes in Beijing, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai convened urgent meetings with Soviet advisors to discuss responses to American success in Korea. Intelligence intercepts suggested that Chinese volunteer units were already crossing the Yalu River in significant numbers, though their exact intentions remained unclear. Mao Zedong viewed American forces approaching China's border as an existential threat that required decisive action regardless of the risks involved. The strategic success of Operation Chromite transformed MacArthur's relationship with political leadership in Washington, creating tensions that would ultimately prove disastrous. The general's conviction that military victory justified political autonomy clashed with President Truman's determination to maintain civilian control over foreign policy. Their fundamental disagreement over war aims would soon explode into public controversy that shattered the unity of purpose that had made the Inchon landing possible. as documented in military historian William Manchester's comprehensive biography, American Caesar. MacArthur's success at Inchon marked both the pinnacle of his career and the beginning of his downfall. The general's absolute confidence in his strategic judgment, vindicated by the brilliant maneuver that saved South Korea, would blind him to the changing political dynamics that made Chinese intervention increasingly likely. Colonel Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's intelligence chief, dismissed reports of Chinese troop movements as propaganda designed to deter American advances into North Korea. The 67-year-old German immigrant had served MacArthur faithfully for decades, but his loyalty created dangerous blind spots in strategic assessment. Willoughby's intelligence failures would contribute directly to the Chinese surprise attack that transformed victory into near disaster within weeks of Seoul's liberation. South Korean forces, revitalized by their government's restoration, pressed northward with enthusiasm that concerned American commanders. President Syngman Rhee's rhetoric about marching to the Yalu reflected popular desire for reunification, but it ignored the complex international dynamics that made such objectives potentially catastrophic. The disconnect between South Korean political goals and American strategic limitations would create ongoing tensions throughout the remainder of the conflict. The success of Operation Chromite established amphibious warfare as a cornerstone of American military doctrine during the Cold War era. Marine Corps schools studied the landing in detail, while Navy planners incorporated lessons learned into contingency plans for conflicts throughout Asia and Europe. The tactical innovations developed during the assault on Inchon would influence American military thinking for decades, though few future operations would match the campaign's dramatic success. Yet, even as MacArthur's forces prepared to cross the 38th parallel in pursuit of total victory, Chinese armies were massing in Manchuria for their own surprise intervention. The general who had achieved military immortality through his brilliant maneuver at Inchon was about to discover that strategic success could create the conditions for even greater strategic failure. The morning of October 7, 1950, found General Douglas MacArthur aboard his command aircraft Baton as it circled over the 38th parallel, the invisible line that had divided Korea for 5 years. Below him, columns of United Nations troops crossed into North Korea in pursuit of the shattered remnants of the Communist Army, their advance made possible by the brilliant success of Operation Chromite just 3 weeks earlier. The 70-year-old commander gazed down at the advancing forces with satisfaction, unaware that Chinese armies were already moving through the mountains of North Korea to spring their own surprise. The immediate aftermath of the Inchon landing had exceeded even MacArthur's optimistic projections. North Korean resistance south of Seoul had collapsed so completely that entire enemy divisions simply evaporated, their soldiers either surrendering or fleeing northward in civilian clothes. Intelligence estimates suggested that Kim Il-sung's original invasion force of 135,000 men had been reduced to fewer than 25,000 effective troops, scattered across North Korea without adequate supplies or communications. Colonel Homer Litzenberg, commanding the 7th Marines, led his regiment across the parallel near Kaesong with mixed emotions about the expanding mission. The veteran officer had witnessed the devastating effectiveness of Marine Corps doctrine during the urban fighting in Seoul, but he worried about extending supply lines deep into North Korea's mountainous terrain. "We're chasing ghosts through country that favors the defender," Litzenberg confided to his staff officers as they established positions north of the parallel. The strategic brilliance of Operation Chromite lay not merely in its tactical execution, but in its psychological impact on all participants in the Korean conflict. North Korean morale had been shattered by the realization that American forces could strike anywhere along their extended coastline, making defensive planning virtually impossible. South Korean confidence had been restored by the dramatic rescue from seemingly certain defeat, while Chinese leaders in Beijing faced the uncomfortable reality that American military competence had been grossly underestimated. President Harry. Truman's decision to authorize MacArthur's advance into North Korea reflected both the intoxication of military success and the domestic political pressures created by that success. Republican critics had demanded to know why American forces should halt at an arbitrary line when complete victory seemed within reach. The president's approval of the Northern advance would prove one of the most consequential decisions of the early Cold War, transforming a regional conflict into a global confrontation. The human cost of MacArthur's masterstroke became clearer as October progressed and casualty reports were compiled. American losses during Operation Chromite totaled 4,400 killed and wounded, while South Korean casualties approached 12,000. North Korean losses remained incalculable, with estimates ranging from 40,000 to 70,000 dead, wounded, and missing during the campaign. Civilian casualties in Seoul alone exceeded 30,000, testament to the brutality of urban warfare in the atomic age. Major General Oliver Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, prepared his forces for winter operations in North Korea despite growing intelligence indicators of Chinese involvement in the conflict. The 57-year-old Marine had led his division through the successful assault on Seoul, but he harbored serious reservations about advancing toward the Yalu River without adequate logistical support. Smith's concerns would prove prophetic when Chinese forces launched their massive counteroffensive in November. The international implications of Operation Chromite extended far beyond the Korean peninsula as world leaders grappled with the demonstration of American military capability. European allies worried that success in Asia might encourage more aggressive American policies elsewhere, while Soviet leaders in Moscow reassessed their strategic position in light of demonstrated United Nations effectiveness. The Cold War balance of power had shifted dramatically in favor of the West, creating new opportunities and new dangers. As documented in historian David McCullough's definitive biography, Truman, the president's relationship with MacArthur began deteriorating almost immediately after the Inchon triumph. The general's public statements about expanding the war into China directly contradicted administration policy, while his dismissive attitude toward United Nations allies reflected a dangerous independence that threatened civilian control of military policy. Their conflict would explode into public controversy within months, culminating in MacArthur's dismissal in April 1951. The tactical innovations pioneered during Operation Chromite revolutionized amphibious warfare doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century. Marine Corps training incorporated lessons learned about urban combat, while Navy planning emphasized the importance of surprise and deception in opposed landings. The success at Inchon validated American military investment in amphibious capabilities, though subsequent operations would rarely match the campaign's dramatic impact. Chinese Premier Mao Zedong's decision to intervene in Korea was directly influenced by the success of MacArthur's strategy. The prospect of American forces controlling all of Korea and potentially threatening China's industrial heartland in Manchuria appeared to justify the enormous risks of confronting United Nations armies. Directly, Mao's volunteers began crossing the Yalu River in significant numbers during late October, setting the stage for the longest retreat in American military history. The Battle of Inchon established Douglas MacArthur as one of history's great military strategists. His reputation secured despite the disasters that would follow. Military academies throughout the world studied Operation Chromite as an example of strategic thinking at its most brilliant, demonstrating how audacity and careful planning could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The landing represented the pinnacle of American military confidence during the early Cold War, a moment when anything seemed possible for forces that combined technological superiority with tactical innovation. Yet the ultimate legacy of MacArthur's masterstroke lay not in its immediate success but in its unintended consequences. The very completeness of victory at Inchon created the conditions for Chinese intervention, transforming a limited conflict into a bloody stalemate that would consume American resources and attention for 3 years. The general who had saved South Korea, through his brilliant maneuver, would soon face the greatest military disaster of his career, as Chinese armies prepared to spring their own surprise in the frozen mountains of North Korea. The Battle of Inchon had indeed saved South Korea from communist conquest, but its strategic consequences would reshape the entire Cold War. MacArthur's brilliant gamble demonstrated that even the most desperate military situations could be reversed through audacious leadership and tactical innovation. The amphibious assault that began on September 15, 1950, remains one of military history's most dramatic reversals of fortune, proving that in warfare, as in life, the impossible becomes possible when courage meets opportunity. The operation's success validated American faith in technological superiority and professional military leadership, establishing precedents that would influence strategic thinking throughout the Cold War era. Marine Corps doctrine, Navy amphibious capabilities, and joint operations planning all evolved from lessons learned during those crucial weeks when the fate of South Korea hung in the balance. The tactical innovations pioneered at Inchon would echo through conflicts from Vietnam to the Persian Gulf, testament to the enduring relevance of MacArthur's strategic vision. Yet history's judgment of Operation Chromite must account for both its immediate triumph and its ultimate consequences. The landing that saved South Korea also triggered Chinese intervention that prolonged the Korean conflict for 3 additional years, costing hundreds of thousands of additional casualties and establishing the precedent for limited wars that would characterize the nuclear age. MacArthur's masterstroke thus became both vindication of American military competence and warning about the uncontrollable dynamics of modern warfare. The fishing boats still sailed from Inchon Harbor as autumn turned to winter in 1950, their nets cast into waters that had witnessed one of history's most audacious military gambles. The seawalls that Marines had scaled under fire resumed their peaceful duty of protecting the port from the Yellow Sea's relentless tides. Yet the memory of those September days would forever mark Inchon as the place where desperate courage and strategic brilliance combined to change the course of history. In the end, the Battle of Inchon stands as testament to the transformative power of military leadership when exercised with wisdom, courage, and absolute determination. MacArthur's amphibious assault did indeed save South Korea from defeat, establishing the foundation for that nation's eventual emergence as a prosperous democracy and strategic ally. The price of that salvation would be measured in years of continued conflict and thousands of additional casualties, but the alternative, communist conquest of the entire Korean peninsula, justified the risks that MacArthur accepted when he ordered his forces to assault the impossible shores of Inchon Harbor. The legacy of that September morning when Marines first scrambled up Inchon's seawalls continues to influence military thinking and strategic planning throughout the world. Operation Chromite proved that audacity, properly applied, could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, a lesson that resonates wherever free nations face the challenges of an uncertain world. In saving South Korea, MacArthur's brilliant maneuver also saved the principle that aggression must not be allowed to succeed, establishing precedents that would guide American foreign policy for decades to come.